go ahead and get started. So this is the economics of mining session. I put together this session at the last minute because I'm really interested in the economic security behind these consensus protocols that we're doing. And I think when we say mining, we might have some conversation about other types of membership protocols as well, not just proof of work. But first, I'd like to introduce Matt Weinberg, who's an assistant professor at Princeton, and will be giving a talk about mechanism design as it applies to cryptocurrencies.
Great, thank you. Okay, so since I actually have no idea quite how broad the audience is, but I assume that it's much broader than I'm used to. So I'm just gonna start by trying to give a sense of what I want to get through in this talk. And I would say maybe the main takeaways are, this, I'm going to remind you of this at the end, and then the entire talk is just going to be filled with like examples of me trying to back this up a little bit. So like Neha said, my background is in mechanism design. So what that means is the entire talk is going to focus on the design of cryptocurrencies. I'm not going to focus on why they have value or that kind of economics. It's just going to be the economics of securing cryptocurrencies. And the other thing that means is that unlike some of the other morning talks, I'm only going to focus on what I would call maybe a strategic attack versus a malicious attack. So the only kinds of things I'm going to talk about are deviations that don't really interfere with consensus. The consensus is still going to work, but whoever's launching the attack is going to get extra money that they weren't supposed to get. And kind of like my impression is that most people understand that this is kind of like a long-term concern because it poses an indirect threat to consensus, even though the individual attack itself is not itself disrupting consensus immediately. The other distinction I would like to make is that the kind of stuff that's going to come up in this talk again is you're going to see sort of like stylized models, and you're going to look at it and you're going to say that's missing some aspect of the model. And I kind of want to point out that's intended and that's by design, because the point of this kind of research is to understand one aspect at a time really well. The point of the research that I'm going to talk about is not to design a full implementation that is perfect and works. The goal is to understand one aspect at a time and kind of give advice to people who are better at engineering or better at designing protocols. But again, the goal is to understand one aspect at a time. So everything you see, you're going to look at it and you're going to say the model's missing something. Again, that's intended. Okay. And then the last thing I wanted to point out was, so I feel like my main goal is I want to try and represent my research community, which is called economics and computation, because a lot of us are starting to get interested in cryptocurrencies, but we are very different than the other research communities that are here. So I'm going to try my best to do that. But obviously, I'm just one person in this community. I'm not like officially speaking on behalf of this community or anything. So these are my opinions, but I'm going to try and give you a sense of what our community is like. Okay, so now let me start getting into the material and say, what do I mean by a strategic attack? So as a running example, imagine that you're participating in something like Nakamoto consensus. Then there are some things that you just can't do, right? So you can't just forge transactions without breaking digital signatures. You can't just retroactively change contents of a block without finding collisions in a hash function. And the idea is that state-of-the-art cryptography is very good at some things. And just by using cryptography, we can, prove that unless you break cryptography, you can't do stuff like this. But stuff that you can do is if, again, Nakamoto consensus as an example, when you create a block, you can point to any block you want as the previous block. It doesn't have to be the longest chain. And when you create a new block, you don't have to broadcast it immediately. You can hide it. You can selectively propagate it. And when you're including transactions, you don't have to include a full block. You don't have to include the transactions which are paying you the most. You can include whatever set you want. And just the idea to have in mind is that it's not that we need cryptography to be better to resolve these problems. There's no hope of cryptography addressing these problems. These are really incentive problems. You need to incentivize miners. If you want them to behave in a certain way, you need to incentivize them. You can't just force them to do it with cryptography. And then again, just to be clear, in this talk, I'm not going to talk at all about eclipse attacks or network partitioning attacks or anything to do with latency or the kind of stuff you would normally see in distributed computing. And again, the reason is that I want to really isolate one aspect and understand it well. Okay, and so to do that, I'm going to try to give a brief overview of several topics. And so what that means is in this talk, I'm not going to get deep into anything. but I am happy to offline talk forever about any of them. So if you're interested, you can ask me. And again, the sampling of topics is biased towards my own research just because that's what I know best, and so those are the examples I can present better. Okay, and I won't read through the list. This is just, again, representative topics that I want to cover. So I'll actually start by defining a formal game, just so, again, I can give you a sense of what does a typical EC result look like, and then I'll apply it in a couple of these other settings. Okay, so the first thing I want to do, I'm going to present a model. It's going to be a mathematically formal model, and then I'm going to state some results that are true in this model. And the reason I want to go through this is, again, just to show you the process that goes into like writing an EC paper. So here's what I want to do. I want to create a game, and I want to claim that it does a good job of capturing miner incentives when they are participating in a proof-of-work-based cryptocurrency. Say, for instance, it's based on Nakamoto consensus or Bitcoin. So the setup I want to have, I'm going to say, okay, there's a bunch of miners, and every miner has some mining power. And just for simplicity, let me say the mining power sum to 1. So XM is exactly the probability that that miner finds an X block. And at all points in time, I want to say that this miner is aware of some directed tree. So think of this as there's some genesis block that everyone agrees on. And then every time someone creates a new block, I'll think of that as a node in this tree. And I'll think of a directed edge as pointing to the previous block that you're claiming is in your building off of. Okay, so at every time step, I'm just going to go 1, 2, 3 up to infinity. A random miner is going to be selected to create a block proportional to their computational power. When you create a block, you create a node in your own graph. And when you create a node, you can add a directed edge to any other node in your graph, right? So that's trying to capture. You don't have to follow the longest chain. Maybe that's what the protocol would ask you to do, but you can point to any block you want. And at every time step, you can also broadcast any of the nodes that you created or that you're aware of. You can broadcast them to any other nodes you want. But again, you don't have to. There's no cryptography forcing you to do that. And what are the payoffs in this game? So I want to take the limit as the number of steps go to infinity of the fraction of blocks that M creates in the longest chain. And I'll call that their payoff. Okay, so this is a one-slide description of the game. I want to highlight some aspects of it on the next slide, and then I'll pause if there are questions about parsing this. Okay, so this is the game. And what I want to do is emphasize what are the modeling assumptions that I made going in, and which ones do I consider significant and not significant. So one thing I did was I just kind of said that time steps are discrete. And I said every time step, someone is finding a block. And we all know that's not how proof of work works. We know that blocks are found according to an exponential distribution. And so I'm abstracting this away and saying that I don't think it matters for the model. In this step, I just said that there's one operation called broadcast. If you broadcast your nodes, everyone hears about it and everyone hears about it instantly. And it's not the case that you can, for instance, selectively broadcast your node to some people but not others, or that I'm also completely abstracting away latency from that. And when I define the payoffs, I want to note that this is assuming that the players are trying to maximize the Bitcoin they get per unit time. And it's also assuming that the rewards are driven entirely by the block reward. And so it's assuming that the transaction fees are 0. Okay, so let me now go through each of these assumptions and say what I think about them, and also what I think you should think about them. So for things like abstracting away the exponential time to find blocks, that definitely makes the model and the math a lot simpler to explain and analyze. And it's superficially, it seems less realistic. I don't think this actually affects the qualitative conclusions that you would draw from this model at all. So I don't think something like this should bother you. You should say, okay, mathematically it's a little bit different, but it seems like I'm going to get the same conclusions. And I would say the same thing for abstracting away this point-to-point communication and latency. Like, yes, you should care about latency for all of the distributed systems concerns. Otherwise, otherwise it becomes a trivial distributed systems problem. But from the perspective of incentives, I don't think latency plays a huge role. For the last assumption, this one I think is different. So first, when I say I'm assuming that the players are trying to maximize their Bitcoin per unit time and that there are no transaction fees, this I think is significant, right? So the terms I would use is that it assumes, for instance, that the exchange rate between US dollars and Bitcoin is what economists would call exogenous. It means that if I am doing something like selfish mining, I'm not affecting the value of Bitcoin, and I really still want to just maximize the number of Bitcoin that I get. And that's a real assumption that I think someone, could challenge. And it also assumes that there's a block reward dominating transaction fees. I don't think it's a huge deal to say that the transaction fees are zero when they're really very small, but it's a huge deal, I think, to say that the transaction fees are zero when actually you're paid entirely in transaction fees. So what I would say you should try and parse this assumption is I would say that results under these assumptions, I absolutely think give valuable insight into one aspect of designing incentive-compatible cryptocurrencies, but I simultaneously believe that future work should also examine, for instance, when the exchange rate is endogenous instead of exogenous, and for instance, when transaction fees matter instead of the block reward. So I can believe all of those things simultaneously and still value what's done in this model. So I guess now I will quickly pause in case there's questions just on parsing the model, and if there's no questions, then I'll start stating some results.
So you said that parties, on the last point, that parties try to maximize the number of Bitcoin that they get. But in this model, if I'm not mistaken, they maximize the relative Bitcoin that they get to the rest of the network. So does
Good.
that make a difference?
So I would say it's the Bitcoin per unit time. So think of this as, so in Bitcoin, there's this difficulty adjustment. So that means the longest chain grows by every like 2048 blocks every 2 weeks. So that means that if you're using some weird strategy that makes a lot of blocks, but that they're not in the longest chain, or you can cause other people to make blocks that are not in the longest chain, you affect the time it takes to make new blocks. So the idea is that, think of it like this, the length of the longest chain is proportional to time. So if you want to maximize Bitcoin per unit time, you want to maximize blocks in the longest chain per size of the longest chain. So that's what I'm claiming here.
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah.
So you kind of qualified the exogenous assumption, but I still want to click on it. Fundamentally, and I think the colleague is also blogging about it, if I succeed in attacking Bitcoin or Ethereum network slightly, then you kind of can cap the reward that I get and compute whether it was worthwhile to mount this attack and how much it costs. But if I succeed in really attacking it and bringing it down to its knees, the real protection is that I'm going to hurt myself. I'm going to essentially devalue the coin to such an extent that I'm not getting it. So it's inherent in any.
Good. So I think that's an example of what I would say is just I'm not the right person to answer that question, just because that's not the, so the question was more about like, there's a difference between you affect a currency a little bit and you affect the exchange rate a little bit. That's the kind of stuff that I would say you could model like this, versus something where you do so much selfish mining that the currency is now worthless, or you do whatever you do so that the currency is worthless. And I would say that, mechanism design is, I think, not the right way to think of that. I think that classical distributed systems are already doing a good job thinking about those problems. Okay. Okay, so since let me just, a quick sanity, let me skip this. If you want to do a sanity check to confirm that you understand what the model is, that's a sanity check of what the longest chain protocol would sound like in that language. And let me just kind of remind you of the story that happened leading up to selfish mining. So in Nakamoto's first paper, there was some intuition suggesting that if all other miners follow the longest chain protocol, and you have less than 50% of the computational power in the network, then your best response in this game is also to follow the longest chain protocol. Now, of course, Nakamoto did not say it in this language, but I would say that's kind of the reasonable conclusion that most people drew and believed for a long time. And there was even this correct random walk analysis in the paper that basically said that there's a specific kind of strategy that will not work if you have less than 50% of the total computational power. And then this is roughly around the time that kind of got me interested in cryptocurrencies. There was this big result from Eyal and Sirer that's now called the selfish mining attack, which said that actually you can have less than 50% of the total computational power as long as you have more than a third. And then there is something better you can do. If everyone else is following the longest chain protocol, you can do better than following the protocol yourself. And I have no idea if everyone in the room already knows what I'm about to say, but just in case, the main idea is when you create a block, you should hide it. And from here, two things can happen. Maybe you get lucky and you mine 2 rounds in a row. And now that you kind of have this private chain of length 2, you can use this to guarantee that you're in the longest chain and cancel blocks that other miners are creating, and that will get you more reward. You also might get unlucky, and maybe you don't mine in the next round, and you might lose that block, and that's bad, but it turns out that when you have more than a third of the total computational power, the expected gain is bigger than the expected loss. And maybe quick things I want to highlight about this is that if for some reason you were able to predict more about the future, and for some reason you knew your likelihood of mining the next round more accurately, you would again mitigate the expected loss. And what was the second one I wanted to... the second one I wanted to emphasize is that the expected loss comes from losing the rewards in the block you're creating. So both of those things will come up very quickly when I kind of dash through some of the other stuff. So more recently, there was follow-up work to this. They kind of said, okay, that is true that, selfish mining says that 50% is not the right cutoff, but it turns out that with 30%, then you can make the same claim. Okay, so if every other miner is using longest chain in this game, and you have less than 30% of the total mining power, your best response is also to use longest chain. So it kind of mitigates the damage that was caused by selfish mining. Okay, so my understanding of reality, at least hearing from one of those authors, is that selfish mining has not been detected on Bitcoin, but it has been detected on smaller altcoins. And now I just want to give, in the context of this, what would be the goal of like EC research? Is we would like to understand qualitatively why is it the case that selfish mining has not been detected on Bitcoin, but it has been detected elsewhere. And the idea is, one possibility is that no single miner has more than 30% of the computational power. I'm actually not sure that, there are periods where that has been false for Bitcoin. And my best guess is that most likely it's because the dollar to Bitcoin exchange rate is not exogenous and that was not the right assumption to make. And probably sustained selfish mining might hurt the value of Bitcoin. And the question that this makes me think of is that, yes, maybe right now that would discourage someone with 40% of the mining power to selfish mine. But what would happen if a large miner could short sell Bitcoin and then they weren't affected by the fact that the exchange rate went down? And currently you can't do something like that, but eventually that might no longer change. So the idea is that I would say the value of this kind of research is trying to really understand why is it the case that on one currency you see it, on another currency you don't, and if things change in the future, what things should you be looking out for? Okay, so I think I don't have enough time to go through everything that I wanted to, or nearly everything that I wanted to say. So I think what I want to do is just kind of like state a few results and then kind of go to my last slide, and then Neha said there'll be lots of questions later. So let me just say one result that maybe will not be super clear since I didn't get to build up the model. But if in the case where transaction fees become dominant instead of block rewards for payment, so this is work this is Miles Karsten, Harry Kolodner, and Arvind Narayanan. We showed that the incentive issues are way more complex for transaction fees than block reward, even if all of the miners are risk neutral. Roughly, some intuition you should have if you're following the stuff on selfish mining is that when you're rewarded by transaction fees, it's just possible sometimes you're going to mine a block that was not worth all that much. If you happen to mine a block that's not worth all that much, you may as well hide it and try to selfish mine because the cost is low. Okay, and so that's one reason why the incentives are very different. There's other stuff going on too, but I will definitely... Okay, so I'll skip over this and I'll just make one last point. So one last point about the difference between proof of stake and proof of work, I would say, is where is the source of randomness coming from? So the way I think of proof of work is that there's somehow there's this like magic external source of randomness that has nice properties, which is who happens to be the next miner to invert the hash function. And it turns out it's just very hard to get that kind of pure randomness using the cryptocurrency itself as a source of randomness. And I would say the main result I want to take away here is that, so I mentioned that if somehow your randomness had the property that you could predict a little bit in the future, more accurately how likely you were to be the next miner, you could do selfish mining better. Because you could know to only withhold your block if you're going to be successful, and don't withhold your block if you're not going to be the next miner. And so it turns out there's actually a formal theorem that says kind of any proof-of-stake protocol based on Nakamoto consensus is more vulnerable to selfish mining than the proof-of-work counterparts. Last thing, I'm just going to skip through this. I will just pause and say... All right, so I'll just leave this paused. If anything sounds interesting about this, I'll talk more about it during questions or ask me later. And I'll repeat the main takeaways on the last slide. Okay, so I guess the fact that people are here means that hopefully people understand that I think incentives are really important. Again, I don't think they should replace classic distributed systems analysis, but I do think it's important to also do mechanism design style analysis. And again, the main thing that I hope you took away from the examples is that our community tends to focus on what I was terming consulting versus engineering. We try to write one paper that understands one aspect very well. And so what that means is that every paper has something unrealistic about the model, but that's by design because we need to understand that one aspect really, really well. And so again, what you should think of the goal of this research is to build a body of research which lets us reason, for instance, about new protocols before they're deployed or circumstances before they actually change, because we have a good idea of what each of the individual components do. But maybe for a given, but for a specific protocol in a specific time, of course, doing specific analysis to that protocol at that time is going to be more useful. All right, let me just stop there because I think I'm now out of time, and offline or during the session, I'll answer whatever questions come up.